Welcome, everyone, to this week's episode of Encounter with God Together, our weekly audio and video podcast that goes through the readings in our daily Bible reading guide by the same name, Encounter with God. Each week, I welcome a guest who reviews the week ahead for us. And today, I'm really happy to welcome Dan Garrison Edwards. Dan is on staff at the Church of the Good Samaritan in Paoli as the Director of College and what was it again, Dan?
Director of College and Young Adult Ministries.
And Young Adult, sorry. The Director of College and Young Adult Ministries. And he's also on staff with CCO, a ministry that reaches out to campuses, and he works in some campuses in the greater Philadelphia area. Dan, it's great to have you here.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to discuss this morning.
Yes, I'm glad to have you as well. And thank you for coming during Holy Week, which I know is a super busy week for you. So we are back in Job. We finished out in Matthew last week or this past week, the Passion Week. And now we're starting in Job this week. And Dan, I know you were doing some of the last words of Jesus. And so you're in the suffering mode. And so it's great to have you. And I'm going to just pray for you a minute and then turn it over to you to share. So, Father, I do thank you for Dan. I thank you for his ministry. I thank you for his work and passion for this generation. And I pray that you would use him to really deliver good news to those who are in need, which is all of us. And Father, I thank you so much for his willingness to be here today. I pray that you would speak through him by your Spirit. In Jesus' name, amen. So over to you for some thoughts on Job. We are in Job 37 through 40, right?
Yes, we are right before we jump into the divine speeches where God finally responds to Job. Job has spent the majority of this book making his case to God, as well as hearing his friends respond. His friends do a pretty good job of being his friends until they open their mouths. They sit with him for an extended period of time in silence while Job is mulling over and I guess processing these incredible experiences of loss that he has had. One of the things that I love about Job as a book as a whole is I think it's a book that pushes us to really wrestle with the idea like, well, what does God do with all of our grief and all of our complaining? Because I think it is very much just part of our desire to want to hold somebody responsible for the bad things that happen to us. And one of the things that always stands out to me is the ways that when we talk about Job, we often talk about Job in terms of the question of why do bad things happen to good people? And it's always very funny to me that we talk that way, because that's not actually the question that Job has. That the question that Job always comes back to is not, I'm such a good person, why is this happening to me? He says, if this is all that I have to live for, why was I ever born? And that all of his complaints or not even his complaints, his proclamations or his cries to the heavens and to his friends are it would have been better for me never to have been born if these things than for these things to have happened to me. And I think that's a much more that's like a very heavy existential question of like, well, what are we here for? Why are we here just to endure suffering? I think sometimes Job can be the most we have to be careful not to read Job as the most nihilistic book in the Bible, because it very much lends itself in that direction. Because I think it's an experience that I think many of us have of what moment was I born into. And what I really find encouraging about Job is that his friends always are giving him these reasons. Well, here's why you're suffering. Here's why you're suffering. Here's why you're suffering. And that's not their. And once again, they're not really answering a question that Job is asking. And sometimes Job wants to know, like, God, why, where are you in all of this? And why was I made if I'm going to be if these things are going to be inflicted upon me? Which is a fascinating question, given that in the prologue of the story, as we have it, God and the devil have sort of, God and Satan have sort of set up this, it feels a little sacrilegious to say a bet, but they've made an arrangement as the narrative tells it. And God has been the one that has done these things to Job, as the narrative tells it. Now that's a big theological question that I think is outside of the scope to try to unpack this
He's
point.
at least allowed it, right? Yes.
He's at least allowed it. That's right.
Mm-hmm.
So in many ways, in the context of the narrative of Job, in some sense, like Job has an appropriate assessment of what's going on to say, no, if I'm going to, this stuff has happened to me seemingly at random, I'm going to make this appeal. You know, that it's not, why have these happened to me? Because, well, if this is all this has happened to me, why was I born for this? Because right now this kind of just feels like my purpose. And one of the things that I love is, I love the idea that God does hear Job, and God does come to respond. And when Job's friends are trying to give very well thought out, very theological answers to Job's suffering, Job is saying, none of this is answering my question. And yet when God shows up, God's answer to Job is really, here's just the majesty of who I am. One of the things that I think really stood out to me as I was going through the devotionals for this week is when God talks about this, I put the stars in the skies, and that's actually a direct echo. I marked it down. Let's see if I can find it. Job cites those same constellations earlier about, well, if God has put these things in here, like, who am I really to talk to him? But I still insist that he needs to, that I want him to respond to me. So there's this, so I think it's fascinating that even for the ways that the divine speeches in Job are God coming to Job saying, here's my majesty. Here's the ways that I've created the world. Here are the things that you can't fathom. He is still going to echo Job's own words to him that reflect that Job, that he's not necessarily telling Job things that Job doesn't already know. I think to some extent what God is doing in this divine speeches is almost reminding Job, because Job has already identified these things. And now in his grief, God needs to remind him about no, like, I am the things that you have said I am. I am this God, and that means that there's a strange mystery to it. And there's something about, I think, what does it mean to almost be cradled in the majesty of God? To say, oh, when I'm at a loss for everything, the majesty of God can hold me. Yeah, and I think there's the divine speeches in Job when we have a lot to not only not only have a beautiful creation narrative of how God has ordained the way things are, but also has all this imagery of the way God relates to chaos. That there's these big beasts, that there's these giant storms, and so much of it is God is like God curbing or putting some boundaries on that. I think at least in Job, we don't necessarily get an image of a God who is creating a lot of structure and order so much as we get a God that kind of comes in, and it's like God is putting a lasso on the chaos of the world, and he's winding that centrifugal force back in for beauty and for goodness. And I think that I think is sometimes how we start to process our own suffering and think through our own suffering when we talk about looking back on, here are the things that happened that God has used for good. I think that that I think fits that kind of idea of, well, it can feel very flippant and trite to have somebody say, well, obviously this happened to you, so God could do this, right? That you're like, well, no, that's an awful thing to receive.
How comforting.
There's no comfort in that. There's a different kind of comfort to say, oh, well, the chaos is happening in my life, and there's suffering and there's tragedy and there's trauma, but here is God entering into the scene and takes all that chaos and spins that centrifugal force of that chaos into something for God's good. I mean, that's much more of a pastoral response than it is a systematic theological response. But I think I do think that's what the divine speeches in Job largely are illustrating, is that kind of idea.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really liked, especially thinking through this past week, that we went through, where the commentator in the notes this week mentions the donkey that Jesus rode in on, and I hadn't really thought about it as a wild donkey that needed to be tamed, but that he showed his ability to tame the wild even in that triumphant entry, and that was a fun little note for me.
Yeah, absolutely. That I think, and that stood out to me too. Just that that image, right? Of I haven't spent a lot of time around horses or donkeys. I do know in a small way, even something like, what does it feel like to try to train a dog? Right? There's like, it's not, and you're not even trying to ride that,
Right.
trying to scale that up. And I think it's an important reflection since we're recording this on Holy Saturday. I think it's an important reflection for coming out of Good Friday and moving into Easter is what was the experience of Good Friday like? Like, it's just this complete and total disorientation. And also, I think, well, Jesus doesn't ask this. I'm sure many of his disciples, perhaps even Jesus' own mother, looks upon the crucifixion and says, was Jesus only born for this? Like, was this 3 years of ministry? Was this life just for this moment? And then God's answer is continually no. There's so much more majesty to it.
That's great. And I just came out of a week of being in Arizona visiting the Grand Canyon, which has been on my list for a while. And my kids last synced up spring break, so we went. But talk about an experience of God's majesty. And we went to the Lowell Observatory where Jupiter was discovered, and had a little talk on the constellations. So it was fun for me for those stars to align this week with Orion, and just thinking about just how big, how vast the whole universe is, and God's over it all.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I like not to get too specific, but I think especially as the devotions for this week move towards this idea of what does it mean for our God to be too small? I think we really enjoy powerful images. One of the things I said yesterday during preaching on one of the last 7 words of Christ was I said, it should come as no wonder to us that we can go see 4 superhero movies at least in the course of a year, because we really like these powerful images. We really like these omnipotent heroes that if they experience any suffering or any trouble, it happens like on a far off planet, or they're not the Avengers aren't necessarily dealing with anything seriously. They're not dealing with any serious systemic injustice in our world. They're fighting, they're fighting aliens or time travel like that. But what it is, we really like these powerful images, and yet when we think of I think oftentimes when we first hear it, our God is too small. We're talking about what is the potential of power that our God ought to have. When really sometimes I think what is happening with Job is the idea of, well, when we say our God is too small, what we're really saying is, what capacity does God have to? Are we selling God short for not being able to bear all that we come to God with? God comes to speak to Job out of a storm, which is a fierce image. But at the same time, the people who get rebuked and are told to come back and make sacrifices are Job's friends at the end of the story. Job says that he repents, but that's not necessarily what God in the divine speeches is asking for, right? Like, Job is the one that has gone before God saying, I know your character, and I am confused, and I'm in grief, and I'm in pain because I don't expect this to happen with your character. And I think Job really comes to God with a certain degree of trust. It's like when you have friends or family that you love well, like that you can fight with them well, and that if you think that for whatever reason they're not living up to their end of the relationship, you get to talk with them about that in very passionate terms. And I think I think that's what's happening here. Is I think Job trusts that God can. It's weird to say, oh, God can be held accountable. That's not quite the right words, but Job can say, God ought to be able to give me an explanation of some sort for this, and God does. Now the explanation isn't necessarily what Job's looking for, but I think the idea is like, well, this God is big. Not only is this God big enough to create the heavens and create the constellations and fight and rain and sea monsters and create giant beasts and fill the heavens with snow. This is also a God who's big enough to bear our burdens and maybe even our own accusations. And that's present throughout, like, through our Psalms of Lament. That's present throughout different moments as Moses interacts with God and the Pentateuch and everything. I think that's what it means when can God be big enough to handle all that we come to God with?
Yes. Very good. Thank you so much, Dan. Any more thoughts you have on this before we close out the session?
I think the last thing I'll say is I think since we're recording this on Holy Saturday, I'm always hesitant to jump ahead to Easter too quickly. But
we'll be watching it on Easter, after Easter, probably.
Yeah, we'll be watching after Easter. I think there's something very moving about thinking that the same God who comes to meet Job and responds to Job with force and with majesty and with authority, but also with lots of mercy and lots of compassion, is also the same God that becomes incarnate in Jesus Christ. That there's, I think we can see similarities in the way that Jesus responds most compassionately to the people who seem to have pushed the boundaries on what you can do with God the most. I'm thinking of, like, the woman who just comes out of the crowd after she's been suffering from bleeding for her whole life and just wants to touch Jesus's cloak, or the Syrophoenician woman who's going to come break all these social mores to come and talk to Jesus. I think there is something about when we see it both here in Job, and we see it with Jesus of what does it mean to really trust that we have a God that we can maybe push some boundaries with, or at least push the boundaries that folks say, no, you can't say that to God. Now there are things that that are absolutely disrespectful to say to God, but then to be able to go in that to be able to come before Jesus and trust that there is healing there, and that to do that may require pushing at the boundaries at what our community thinks is important, or what our trusted friends think is important. I think we see that in many of the folks, particularly the women who come to approach Jesus, and I think that's what we see in Job, and I think we see both in the divine speeches and Jesus' response in those instances to be very similar. Moments where Jesus both invokes his own references and invokes his own authority, but also recognizes and affirms that desire for that kind of healing. So I think that's the week of Easter is a great place to put a bow on.
Yes. Oh, there's so much here, Dan, and I think we could just keep making the comparisons and digging deep into the character of God and the demonstration of compassion in Jesus entering humanity and experiencing, taking it on. Wow.
I will, well, let me pray for our friends who will be reading this with us this week.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Almighty and everlasting God, we thank you for this week. We thank you for the ways that you come to meet us, the ways that you invite us to come to you with honesty, to come to you with all of our grief and all of our sorrow. We thank you that you are a God who responds to us, that hears our cries. And we thank you that, most of all, in response to our cry, you became man, that you took on humanity, and that you made a way through death on the cross into new life and into resurrection. In all things we do, may we continue to trust that you love us, that you long to hear for us, and that you respond to us. And that even when that answer is not what we were expecting, that you say it with love and compassion, and oftentimes as a reminder of what we already know about you.
Mm.
We say all those things, and we offer all this up in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much, Dan. That was a timely passages, and I really think you hit some important points for us, and I'm going to be thinking about them this week. It's deep.
Thank you so much, Gail. This is great.
Yeah, good to have you with us, and I'm hopeful that we'll have you back again. And
okay.
We're recording before Easter, so I wish you a blessed Easter celebration. And hope to see you all soon. Remember, if you don't have the guide, you can get it on our website, scriptureunion.org, or you can read it online. You can have it delivered to your email, or you can order the print version and become a member. So if you've come upon us and you're not already reading, I want you to be able to get a hold of these readings. Thanks, Dan, and we'll see you again soon. Have a wonderful week, everyone. Bye for now.